Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Calendar Club.
Welcome.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Okay, let's get started.
We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at part 2 today. It's going to be a little bit different, maybe answer some of the questions from yesterday. And for those that have seen this before, I hope it's just a really good review. For those of you that this is going to be brand new, there may be some questions, and we'll take those at the end. But today we're going to look at prophetic timelines. Just a little bit about prophetic timelines. We're going to reach into Revelation, so show you some examples, because Daniel sets down the groundwork for how to work with timelines. So we're just going to look a little bit into Revelation and see. Daniel does things the easy way. John kind of mixes things up a little bit. So we're going to look at that. We're going to reach into the 1800s a little bit, because that has something to do with Daniel as well. We just want to demonstrate some concepts. So there's a lot of things that are happening here today, and all of these are concepts for the foundations of a timeline study. So also we're going to break open a Daniel secret. But just a little tiny review here from part 1. We looked at the structure of Daniel, and that it had these different components here. He always starts his visions with a heavenly scene. At the end of the heavenly scene, there's an interlude question, an interruption, where Daniel says, or the king says, what is happening here? What does this mean? And then Daniel will give the outline or the interpretation of that heavenly scene. And then after that, the verses will follow with an answer to that interlude question at the top. And of course, at the end, you'll have your end time event. All of Daniel's 4 visions around Yah's people in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and then the 4th vision, that is 10, 11, and 12, follow this structure. But the Daniel 4 vision that is from the king, it follows the exact same structure. It's a very simple pattern, and what you want to remember is everything has to have a forward progressive movement. That's going to do you well for a long time in all of your studies, always keeping things in a forward progressive manner. We also learned a little bit about English lessons, about similes and metaphors, how they are part of literal language, that when you see a simile or metaphor, it does not mean that the vision is symbolic. And similes use words like or as to do comparisons, and metaphors just compare with using phrases. Remember, he sounded like a grumpy bear. We used that one, but it was just that sometimes bears are grumpy in the morning. So metaphors are using phrases for comparisons. In Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar is compared to a tree. It's a metaphor. We also found in part 1 of the study that Daniel had access to prophecies that Ezekiel had written about Jehoiachin, Assyria's king, and about an Egyptian pharaoh. And both of them were compared to cedar trees that were cut down and never ever sprouted again. They were never put back on their thrones to rule. And Daniel had those prophecies from Ezekiel about 20 years before King Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. So he probably had a good long time to understand this history that had happened in his lifetime. And don't forget, Ezekiel was in the court, not in the court of Babylon, but he was in Babylon. I'm not sure, but he might have had access to Ezekiel by letter or who knows what. But when Daniel heard the king's dream, he knew exactly what was coming. And he just merely made an application to the Babylonian king. You're the leader, and you're going to get cut down. But guess what, king? There's some good news. We're going to bind the stump, and it is going to sprout again. And Daniel said, for 7 years, you'll be taken off your throne. I love this verse from Isaiah 46, 9, and 10. It's my favorite out of about 7 of them in Isaiah, declaring the end from the beginning. That's why the Daniel timelines are so important is because they can declare to us from his book way back about 600 BC how it's going to be in the very end for timelines and also during the gospel. Remember the former things of old, for I am Yahuwah, and there is none else. Nobody else declares the end from the beginning, from ancient times, the things that are not yet done. And he says, my counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure. Yah is saying, I'm going to have the last word, and you're going to find out that in the end, it was just the way I said in the beginning. It's got such a lot of meaning in that scripture. So we're going to look at number 4 and number 5 today out of our 7 little points of understanding timelines. And point number 4 is going to be a discussion between prophetic terminology or prophetic time. Now, you all know that Tim and I were raised in a Sabbath-keeping church, Adventism, and they do a lot with prophecy. A lot of the Sunday churches or people that I know from other denominations don't do a lot with prophecy. It seems like the Advent movement back in the early 1800s really caught on to this thing about prophecy, that there was something there for Yah's people to understand. In our understanding and denomination, these terms, prophetic terminology and prophetic time, were never defined very well. It was sort of a mishmash and all meant the same thing. So we're going to take a look at this today. It might be brand new for some of you. And of course, in the Daniel book, we have prophetic key. It's one of those rules, number 22. And this is what it says. When a prophecy is written with symbols or literal language, all the timelines that are inside that prophecy are prophetic time. Now that might not sound like it's making any sense, or it might sound like, what does it really mean? It means that if you have a prophecy that is in symbolism, like Daniel chapter 2, if there was a timeline in that chapter, it's a prophetic timeline because it's a prophecy. In other visions, like Daniel chapter 4, it's not a symbolic vision, but there is a timeline. That means it's prophetic time. But prophetic time in a vision with symbols and prophetic time in a vision with just literal language, you calculate the prophetic time a little bit differently. It doesn't mean that just because it's prophetic time, they all get thrown into one pot and are treated the same way. So what is this prophetic terminology? There are 3 phrases from Daniel and Revelation. Boy, I'm just counting on some of you understanding or have read Daniel and Revelation and understand this language. The first one that I want to show you is from Daniel 7:25. And it says time, times, and a dividing of time. It's a timeline. This is prophetic terminology, okay? Instead of giving you a number, it's giving you the prophetic timeline in words. In Daniel 12, chapter 7, there's another timeline, and it's noted this way by Daniel: time, times, and a half. Then in Revelation 12:14, again, you'll find this prophetic terminology of time, times, and a half a time. So this is prophetic terminology. It's telling you about a timeline without mentioning a number. But the question always arises, what is the first thing that you might think about when you see this type of wording? Now, I don't know if just everybody would understand how to answer that, but I'm going to say it again in case you have a background that understands this kind of language. What is the first thing that you think about when you see this kind of wording? This time, times and the dividing of time. Well, I was taught when you see that or read it, this is what it means. 1 day in prophecy equals 1 year, and that's it. There's no other rules. 1 day equals 1 year. So 1 literal day is going to be converted to a literal 1 year. 1 symbolic day will equal 1 literal year. But I have news for all of you. That's not the right answer. When you see that prophetic terminology, it does not mean that 1 symbolic day is equal to 1 year. It doesn't always mean that. It is a prophetic rule. This is not prophetic terminology. 1 day equals 1 year is a rule, and we do use that rule, but you don't use it consistently for every timeline in any vision. That rule is only used when there's symbols. When you can find symbols, we're going to look at that. So the correct answer is, for these 3 phrases, time, times, and dividing of time, they're almost all identical, and they all have the same number attached to them. Time times and a half, or times and a half a time. That is prophetic terminology. And all it's telling you is that it's indicating that there is a timeline that is contained within the prophecy. But the vision or the prophecy could be written with symbols, or it could just be literal language, just plain ordinary language. There doesn't always have to be symbols involved. In prophetic key number 22, it says this: whether a prophecy is written with symbolic or literal language, all the timelines that are inside that prophecy, they're always prophetic time. That's a simple rule. It's prophetic time. But the question is, what kind of prophetic time is it? We need to figure that out. That's why we're wondering, with Daniel chapter 4, is there symbolism in that chapter or not? We're trying to determine what's going on with Daniel chapter 4, because he holds the secrets right there. So there are some steps that we need to remember when we're working with timelines. Here they are, and they're really easy. Step number 1. First, you need to determine if the vision contains symbolic language or if it's just literal language. Then, step number 2, you take your information and you apply that information to the timeline. So if you have a vision that's written with symbols, like that lion with wings, and that leopard that had also 4 wings, and that dragon, that beast, those are all symbols in Daniel chapter 7. So when you have symbolic visions containing timelines, guess what? The timeline is prophetic symbolic time. Second one is, if your vision is just literal, it's just a plain old tree, then your vision is going to, if your vision has a timeline, it's just prophetic literal time. It's just that easy. So 1 day equals 1 day no matter what. It's not hard. So let's do the easy one first. Let's calculate prophetic literal time. Remember, they're all prophetic time, but we need to determine according to the vision whether the prophetic time is going to be literal or symbolic. So any timeline that is given within a literal vision, you all know the answer, it's always prophetic literal time. That timeline does not need to have a conversion, okay? You just leave it alone, and it's easy. It's very, very simple. That's where prophetic key number 25 comes in. Timelines that are contained in a literal context, they are to be understood as literal time. And then you apply this rule. A prophetic day is simply 1 literal day. That's it. Nothing else to one day in that vision of literal prophecy like we have in Daniel 4. It just equals 1 literal day. Well, let's go back to the Strong's and look at this definition for a day. It is sometimes a confusing definition for many, and that's why they get mixed up with how to begin the day. But it's 3117, Yom. It's from an unused root, and it means to be hot. It means a day as the warm hours. That's the very first definition. So the first definition of day is basically your 12 hours. Let's just use 12 hours for day, 12 hours for night, okay? 12 hours of your day, that would be where you have the warmth of your sun or light from the sun. That's your first definition for day. Then it says whether literal or figurative. This is from the Strong's. You'll see I have square brackets here. These square brackets are telling you that I have added this in. But Mr. Strong had made a little bit of a mistake. He said a day, whether literal, and he said from sunrise to sunset. He's basically talking about your warm hours of the day, but we know when that's corrected, it's from boker to arev, or from morning to evening, your 12 hours. So you can have a literal day called just the 12 hours where you have your sunlight. We actually call that a day season. Or he says, and then basically, sorry, let me back up here for a minute. Or you can have a day, meaning he says from one sunset to the next. And we know that that would be from boker to boker. That would be your 24-hour day. And we like to differentiate that, saying that that is a 24-hour cycle. So this word day sometimes can get really confusing. So if you're saying it's just the 12 hours of the day, we like to say day season or night season. If it's a 24-hour cycle, we like to say a cycle instead of day, because it has many different definitions. So those are the literal for day, a day season or a 24-hour cycle. But then look what he also says, or you can have a figurative day. That's a space of time defined by an associated term. This figurative day is what applies to prophecy, where one day can equal something else. One literal day can equal another portion of time. And he has many, many other different definitions for day, like day of Yahweh and whatnot, day of your life, whatnot, that don't apply to calendar. But there are different definitions for day. When we want to look at timelines in Daniel 4, it's a little bit different than what we're going to find in the other visions. Let's just see where these timelines are found in chapter 4. And if you did your homework last night, you're going to already know. It says in verse 16, let his heart be changed from man's, that's the king's heart, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. That was the first place that you found this timeline. Then in verse 23, hew down the tree and destroy it, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. This was Daniel's application to the king. And then verse 25, it says, thy dwelling place is going to be with the beasts of the field, and 7 times are going to pass over you. And verse 32, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen. And guess what? 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Now, this is very unusual, because chapter 4 has this timeline of 7 times recorded 4 times in this chapter. That is unusual. But we already know, we've already done a couple of points, and we have found that Daniel 4 is written in literal language. This prophetic term for this timeline that you find in verses 16, 23, 25, and 32 is identified by Daniel as 7 times. Times in the Strong's is a set time, technically a year. So this simply means that if 7 times is going to be understood, it just basically means that one of those times equals 1 year. That's really easy. Daniel 4, because it's a literal vision, we can then understand this timeline very, very easily. We know it's prophetic literal time because the vision is literal. So that means that these 7 times that are spoken of 4 different times are just only 7 literal years, not anything else, 7 years, and that's it. Now, we're going to look at calculating prophetic symbolic time. That's a little bit different. Here we go. Any timeline that is given within a symbolic vision is most often prophetic symbolic time. And I'm saying most often because you have to know some rules. Sometimes the rules get tweaked a little bit because in Revelation, John does something else. Now, what I want you to know is that Daniel doesn't mess this up in his book at all on a historic application. I know that there's some that are putting Daniel timelines into the end time. That's a little different story. We're talking about a historic application. But John, he does something different, okay? So that's why you need to understand Daniel's timelines to know what to do when you get into Revelation. Daniel is your kindergarten, and Revelation is your university. Any timeline given within a symbolic vision is most often prophetic symbolic time. Then that timeline must be converted so you can understand how much literal time is involved, so you can really understand how many years and days are we working with. And this is where prophetic key number 24 comes in real handy. Timelines contained in a symbolic context are to be understood as symbolic time. And then this is the rule that you apply. The timeline must be decoded with the year-day computation principle. Well, what is that? So let's establish a couple of facts about this principle and this rule. But first, let's look at a couple of other points about Daniel. I want you to remember that the book of Daniel that we're talking about, that I put together, is written on a level of historicism. It's the entry level of understanding Daniel's prophecies based on past historical fact. And that's going to hold true for the understanding of timelines as well. So my book doesn't have the future interpretation of what's happening with Daniel 7, 8, all the way to 12. Just the historic. That's where you need to start first. That's what we're saying. There's many studies that are based on the recent and more current world events. They're not just historical events, but these events are all patterns that are repeating. And that is what we call a second level of Daniel's prophecies. And like I said, those are not in my book. The second level of interpretation has its foundation in the first level of historicism. But it is best that you don't mix the two together because it can get confusing. So if you're talking about the historical level, stay there. If you're going to talk about the second level, then you move there. Then the timelines are treated a little bit separate, a little bit different. Understanding these concepts means that when one advances to understanding Daniel in the second level of application, then guess what? It would also stand to reason that you would have to do something different with the timelines. When you're looking at an end-time application, there isn't going to be time for 1,260 years anymore. Time is running out. So there's a different application for the timelines. But let's look at the year-day computation principle on the historical level. In prophetic key number 24, it tells us that timelines contained within a symbolic context must be decoded with the year-day computation principle as defined by 2 scriptures, and these are them. Ezekiel 4:6. He says, "Thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." And then one from the Torah, Numbers 14:34. "After the number of the days in which you searched out the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, even 40 years. So what we're learning here is that you can use this principle. This is a guideline. This is a hermeneutic. It's a rule of prophecy that when you're working with symbols in a prophecy and there's a timeline, then you can use this rule here. Each day is equal to a year, so you can understand how long the timeline is. However, there are some exceptions. There's always exceptions. We're just going to bump into Revelation for a little bit to show you how this works. Prophetic key number 28. The grammatical language, whether it's literal or symbolic, determines the context of a passage of verses. You will find that you have to pay attention to the grammar, especially the tenses. You have to know if it's past tense, present tense, or future tense, because the tenses will change the picture of what's happening in the verses. So let's see, what is this exception? Well, context is king. That's something that you want to remember. Just like the forward progressive movement is going to be really important here, because it's going to tell you what the context is of a set of scriptures. That you have to pay attention to. You cannot change it. If the tenses are moving your scriptures into the future, you need to go along with it. So this exception is when context is king, it can change what you're doing with the timeline. In prophetic key number 28, this context determines how to interpret time or a timeline within that passage, even when there are symbols present, even when it looks like a symbolic vision. That means that the verse or the passage must be interpreted in the context in which it is written. Why? Because the grammar can't be removed. And a lot of people like to do this. They like to mess with the grammar that has been written down by the prophet, but you can't do that so that you can have what you want with the timeline. It doesn't work that way. So once again, we're going to be back to English lessons. If you're going to remove the context, remove the grammar, the tenses, to make it say what you want it to say, you are in violation of interpretation of that scripture. It's just that simple. So we're going to look at a little bit of this exception in Revelation, because John borrows symbolism from Daniel 7 when he's working in chapter 13. He's talking about a lion that has some wings. You will also see that John chapter 13 happens to mention something about a bear that seems to come out of Daniel 7. He also is mentioning something in Revelation 13 about a leopard. That links to Daniel 7 as well. And he also mentions something about a dreadful beast. So John is borrowing some symbolism from Daniel chapter 7. And some of you may know that there's a timeline in Daniel chapter 7. We read about it, times, in a dividing of time. By the time John has put all of these symbols together from Daniel chapter 7, you might have a beast that looks like this. It has a leopard body. It has a head of a lion. It has the feet of the bear. And it looks like a dreadful beast, just like Daniel chapter 7 talked about it. He talked about 7 heads. There are 7 kingdoms, and just do this really quickly. The 4 heads of Daniel are the lion, which is Babylon. The bear was Medo-Persia. The leopard represented Greece. And then there was this dreadful beast that represents Rome. But John tells you there's a little bit more, and Daniel does too. This is coming out of Daniel. Then there is a little horn, papal Rome. There's a king of fierce countenance in Daniel 8, papal Rome. And then there's the king of the north with his 10 horns there. That is also Rome. That's from Daniel 11. So you've got Rome here is number 4, but it's divided into little horn, papal Rome, king of fierce countenance, papal Rome, and then king of the north, papal Rome. 4 divisions of Rome, but you still only have 4 kingdoms: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Daniel is basically telling you in his book, I want you to pay attention to what's happening with Rome. That's what's at your doorstep every single day from now on. Let's look at Revelation's exception. This is from Revelation 13, and pay attention to the context. He says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and a bear, and a lion. And I saw one of the heads as it was wounded to death." Now, I can't go into a full detail of this prophecy, but as it's saying here, I saw one of the heads as it was wounded to death. Right here in Revelation 3, if you wanted to, you could pencil in a date, because in Daniel chapter 7, there is a timeline that talks about this time, times, and a half a time. And when you do all of the time and the times and a half a time, it comes to 1,260 literal years. And from the time that this little horn was reigning, 1,260 years, it actually reaches to 1798. So you could pencil 1798 into your Revelation 13:3 verse right there. That's where you're at, 1798. And then he goes on to say, "And his deadly wound was healed." This is the wound of this Roman beast. It was healed. But you know what? We don't have a date for that. This wound has not been healed yet, because when it's healed, he'll be completely in charge of this earth. And we're going to call that a one world government. Right now, we're headed into the New World Order, but we need to move to a one world government where he's in charge. We do not have that date yet. That hasn't happened because the events haven't happened in the world. Then it goes on to say, this is still verse 3, "And all the world wandered after the beast." Hasn't happened yet. We're close, but it hasn't happened. So this part of verse 3 in Revelation 13, we can't put a date to it. One of these days we can put a date to it. Let's keep looking. What is happening? We'll skip verse 4. "And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies." This is going to happen after all the world wanders after the beast. Something is given to him, and he's going to be speaking great things and blasphemies. Well, he's already doing that, but I guess it's going to be even greater. We don't have a date for that yet. And you might just kind of notice that the Roman papal system and the Pope there at the top right now, who's Francis, is just kind of being a little bit quiet. There's a lot of things happening in the world, but he's not really coming out with a lot of things yet to lay down the rule. And then it says, "And power was given unto him," look at this word, "to continue 42 months. We have a timeline here. After all this happens, his deadly wound is healed, then all the world is going to wander after the beast. This is all future. This hasn't happened yet. And he's given his mouth to speak great things and blasphemies. This is going to come still in the future. And it says he has the power, and he's going to continue for 42 months. It's a timeline, and it tells you 42 months. Right there, we have a forward progressive movement from verse 1, 2, and 3. It has moved the tenses from 1798 to dates in the future that we don't know what they are yet. We're waiting for those to happen. We don't know when this 42 months is going to begin, but it is in the future. But 42 months is a literal 42 months. We don't need to use this rule, 1 day equals 1 year, because of the context. So Revelation 13 is an incredible exception, because what he's doing is he's actually talking about a very interesting symbolic beast, but his context is moving this all into the future. The context is king here. So it's telling you that that timeline is not going to be a timeline of 1,260 years like it was in Daniel 7 when it had these very same beasts. There's no time for 1,260 years at the very end of time. We know that the second coming is around the corner. This 42 months is a prophetic timeline, but because they're symbols, it is not a symbolic timeline. It's just a literal timeline of 42 months. But Revelation has another timeline. It's in Revelation chapter 20. It's a timeline of 1,000 years. Now, I know it's a controversial timeline. We're not going to go into that right now. But just in case some are wondering, it does say there's that timeline of 1,000 years in Revelation 20, and it talks about it 6 times when you read that verse. Let's just read verses 1 and 2. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon and that old serpent, which is called the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. 1,000 years, and it's listed 6 times in Revelation 20. So if you're going to convert 1 day equals 1 year, because it looks like symbolism is happening there if you read the whole verse, is this really 360,000 literal years? And what about the scripture where Yah says 1 day is like 1,000 years? Like, okay? And 1,000 years is as 1 day. We have to remember those two. So John does a little bit something different in Revelation. Whether this 1,000 years that is being spoken about in Revelation 20 is a literal 1,000 years or just 1 day, that is something that we can talk about a little bit later. But let's just say it is 1,000 years. Revelation 20 does have this wording about 1,000 years of peace. 1,000 years where we're free from Satan. He's bound. He can't tempt anybody anymore. And we're just going to get through this and on to the other side. We cannot assume that every timeline is symbolic time when it comes to prophecy, whether there are symbols or not. We need to check the rules and check carefully and proceed. If there is a context that's moving your prophecy into the future, then you have to decide what you're doing with the timeline. So what is our conclusion for point number 4? Between prophetic terminology and a prophetic rule, what are we going to say? All time in prophecy is always prophetic time. Always, always, always. If you have a timeline, it's prophetic time. It doesn't matter if it's symbolic time or literal time. It is prophetic time. But you have to pay attention to the language of the vision. Is the language symbolic language or is it literal language? And then you have to decide what you're doing with the timeline, especially when you come to places in Revelation where you have your context is king and it's pushing your events into the future. Then you know you're working with a literal timeline, not a symbolic timeline. So that's something that you can work on for some homework. So let's leave that for right now, and let's look at understanding timelines with this repetition of prophecy. I want to tell you that learning does not cease. There is always something new under the sun when it comes to prophecy. So I want to show you something that's new and brand new. This prophetic key is not in the book because I didn't realize it when I was publishing, but it definitely is a prophetic key. And it's an important one. Here it goes. Yahuwah does not repeat things that are of no great consequence. And what we're finding is that when he repeats things more than once, that it's time to perk up your ears and listen. Do you remember back with Joseph when the Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had two dreams. I've had a dream, and there was 2 things that were happening in it. I want to know what it means. Do you remember? It was about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows. And then there was about the 7 plump grains of wheat and the 7 skinny grains of wheat? Well, the vision was given twice to show that it was something important. And that's what Joseph said. He said, oh, Pharaoh, he said, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine. You better get ready. This is going to be serious. It was given twice to show its importance. I really like the sundial event by Hezekiah. That is written 3 times in the Old Testament because it is very important. So when Yahuwah repeats things more than once, it's because there's a reason for it. And it's not just ignore it. He doesn't repeat things that aren't really important. All right. Well, let's go back. Look at some timelines in the book of Daniel. And I'm just assuming that a lot of you understand some of these timelines and where they're written. We're not going to do a study specifically. But in Daniel 7, there's a timeline that says times, and dividing of time. And if you read chapter 7, you will find that this particular timeline in chapter 7 is only written down one single time. That's it, just one time. In Daniel 8, there's a timeline of 2,300 days. And the question is, well, how many times does Daniel mention 2,300 days in chapter 8? Because we know in chapter 4, he had Daniel's timeline for 7 times was written there 4 times. Well, what about this one in Daniel 8 for 2,300 days? How many times is it written in Daniel 8? Just one time. Well, when you pop into Daniel 9, which is a chapter that goes along with Daniel 8, there's a whole bunch of timelines. There's a 7-week timeline, there's 70 weeks, there's one that's called 69 weeks, there's a 62 weeks, there's a 1 week, and there's 2 that are a half a week long. There's just oodles of them. Well, how many times are those mentioned in Daniel 9? And if you read, just once. That's all, just once. And when we pop into Daniel 12, he has 3 timelines. One is called in verse 7, times and a half a time. And then in verse 12, he mentions 1,290 days. He says days specifically. And then the next one, I might have that verse wrong. It might be 11. But anyway, in I think it's verse 12, he's got a 1,335 days. That's what he says, they're days. And how many times does he mention this in Daniel chapter 12? These 3 timelines, just once. They're only written once. It doesn't mean that they're not important because they're only written once, but there is something else that's really important. A little bit more on the timeline of Daniel chapter 4. The question is, how many times is the 7 times timeline mentioned in Daniel chapter 4? And you all know the answer already. It's 4 times. And that should lead you to ask another question too. We'll just review where these timelines are very quickly. In verse 16, you will find the first timeline in the heavenly scene portion of the vision. In verse 23, the timeline shows up in the interpretation portion of the vision. That was another component. In verse 25, the timeline shows up in the interlude answer to the vision. It's in another component. And in verse 32, it shows up at the very end, the end time event for King Nebuchadnezzar being out in the field. So this particular timeline shows up in 4 components of Daniel's vision as it's written in chapter 4. That's the interesting part about this timeline. 7 times timeline, mentioned 4 times in Daniel chapter 4. This timeline, remember, it has nothing to do with Yahuwah's people. This timeline is completely around King Nebuchadnezzar. So the question that you should be asking is, does it seem unusual that this particular timeline for King Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned 4 times when all of the other timelines in Daniel's book that are all around Yah's people are mentioned only once? Does that make sense? Does it seem unusual that King Nebuchadnezzar is being given all of this attention for his timeline? Well, this should really perk up your ears. You should be saying, what is going on here? How come chapter 4 gets so much attention? Well, we're going to come back to that important hermeneutic, the new one. Yahuwah does not repeat things that are of no great consequence. Here's why. That 7-year timeline is mentioned in Daniel 4 different times because Daniel wants you to pay attention what is happening in this chapter. This is the chapter that's going to tell you how to work with timelines, whether they're in Daniel or in Revelation, and timelines in the Gospels as well. This is the one. This is the rule right here. So let's just look at a chart here. Pay attention and keep in mind that we've talked about these structural components. We've got them listed here. This is for Daniel 4 of the heavenly scene. Remember? Then we had this interlude question, this interruption. Then after that, you have a component where you have your application or your interpretation given. Then you have this answer to the question that was up here. And then you have the fulfillment of your prophecy and the end time event. Every vision of Daniel, all of them, are recorded with these components in this order. There's no exceptions to that whatsoever. And we're going to have 2 different kinds of charts that are going to demonstrate. This is chart number 1. Some very interesting things that are happening with the Daniel 4 timeline. So far, all the points that we have considered point to the fact that this vision is literal, completely literal. So we're going to say, well, then the timeline has to be literal time. This first chart also portrays that the vision is literal, and we're going to show you where these 7-year timelines show up. So let's just go looking and finding what we can find in Daniel's book. There's number 1, the first time right there in verse 16, he talks about 7 times. Second time the timeline shows up is down here in the application, there in verse 23. The third time it shows up in a different portion of the vision, it is in verses 25. It shows up here with the answer to the question right there. And then it shows up again the 4th time in verse 32. There you have your forward progressive movement. Verse 16, verse 23, verse 25, and then verse 32. Shows up in these 4 different places. That's interesting. This timeline is showing up in the heavenly scene, in the application, in the answer to the question where the prophecy is going to be told how it's going to be fulfilled, and in the end time event when it was fulfilled. Remember the rule for literal time? 1 time equals 1 year. That's just how simple it is. In the very first component, we have our heavenly scene. So what's going to happen when we calculate this timeline? In the heavenly scene, this timeline is simply 7 years. Then when the timeline shows up again in the prophetic outline that actually gives you in the interpretation, it's simply 7 years. The next time it shows up is down there with the interlude answer, and the king has to dwell with the beast for 7 times. And it's just simply 7 years. And then the last time, the end time event. That's where the king is restored to his kingdom, and it says after 7 years, or 7 times. And the interpretation for this timeline is simply 7 years. It's just that simple. So what we see here between the heavenly scene, we have some very nice alignment. Everything is translating to this timeline being 7 years. The first one, the second one, the third one, and the 4th one. All of them translate to 7 years, 7 literal years. So I would say that this chart looks pretty good, and I would give it an A+. But let's make the assumption that Daniel 4 is a symbolic vision. Let's make the assumption, like many do, that the tree is a symbol. It's not a literal tree, it's a symbol, okay? That's going to change some things. We still find our timeline here. We'll just give a review there for where they can be found. And now we need to do some conversion work. If it's a symbolic vision, then that means we have to convert the timeline from symbolic time to literal time. Remember the rule? One symbolic time, or 1 year, is the same as 360 symbolic days. So the rule is that 1 literal year is going to get converted. What happens here when you convert this 7 times timeline? In 7 times, and you have 360 days in a year, when you calculate this out, it comes to 2,520 days. Then you have to apply the rule. Each day is equal to 1 year. That means 2,520 symbolic days is going to equal 2,520 years. If the heavenly scene is in symbols and there's a timeline there, you have to convert it. There's no question. You don't have any other choices. Well, let's look and see what happens in the prophetic outline. This is the literal interpretation. This is the literal interpretation. Daniel is saying it was given as 7 times. And he's saying it was just a time is a year. That's all it is. 7 years. And in the answer, he's saying it's 7 times. That's 7 years. And in the end time event, the king is restored to his kingdom after 7 times. That's 7 years. Are you seeing a problem here? Between the heavenly scene and the last 3 components of this vision, we have a problem. Things are not lining up. What happened? Well, you know what happened. Chart fails because this is not a symbolic vision. If the heavenly scene is symbolic, you have no choice but to use the rule for conversion. 1 day equals 1 year. Now, the question is, if indeed that is the case, then that means that Nebuchadnezzar would have been released from the field around 1953. If you take 568 BC, when is the approximate time of this vision, when this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, and you add 2,520 years, you will get to around 1953. And guess everyone, that's in our time frame. That means that he would have been in the field a long, long time. Just got out just recently. So where is the problem? Is this our problem, or is this Daniel's problem? No, I want to tell you, everyone, that this portion up here in the heavenly scene, it's our problem, and it's right here. This is where a lot of people have made their mistake. The tree, along with the rest of the vision, is not symbolic, and neither is the timeline. The timeline is very specific. Daniel is demonstrating in the last 3 components that the 7 times is a literal 7 years, and that's it. Now, don't forget that Daniel's book is written with lots of secrets and riddles and puzzles, and he wants you to learn how to solve them. What's happening here is one of those puzzles that we need to investigate. I call it a secret, and it's noteworthy. You need to look at it very carefully. So what is this secret? Here it is. It's the 7-year timeline that's been given within the heavenly scene up here, okay? He is going to interpret it as a literal 7 years. The secret of Daniel 4 is the placement of the 7 times timeline within the heavenly scene portion of the vision. If he wouldn't have put that up here, we would not figure out what he's trying to say with timelines. But I want you to remember, nowhere in Daniel's book does he mix symbolic visions with literal timelines. John does. We saw an example about that. But Daniel doesn't do this. So this particular chart exposes the error. You might need to go back and review this. So what I'm going to tell you is that if this timeline here in Daniel chapter 4 would not have been tucked within the heavenly scene component, then it would be really easy to forget the English rules that literal language uses similes and metaphors. It would be so easy to say that the tree was symbolic and that the following 3 timelines were literal. You could actually do a mix. If this timeline was not written up here in the heavenly scene, then you could do whatever you wanted. Daniel put it there very specifically. In prophetic visions, many do not realize that the similes and metaphors are literal language. Okay, we have a symbolic tree right here. As a consequence, it would have been very easy to say that this tree was a symbolic tree rather than just a literal tree. And because the literal interpretation about the tree and the last 3 timelines is given in the outline verses where the literal interpretation is always given. So down here, this is your outline. This is where the literal interpretation is given. And Daniel did not say anything about 2,520 years. Not here. He just said 7 times. That's all he said. So if indeed this was really literal, we would have, a symbolic vision, we would have lots of problems. In the heavenly scene, a symbolic tree would demand that the timeline has to be symbolic as well. You would not have any choice. If the king had said, I see a tree like this with purple trunk, with leaves that look like chicken wings or whatever, that would have been a symbolic tree. You would have had no choice but to put these timelines into symbolic time. This placement of the timeline right up here in the heavenly scene is extremely crucial. This is going to be the secret that breaks open chapter 12, because chapter 12 has timelines that are very important for Yah's people at the end of time. In chapter 12, Daniel repeats this secret pattern once again, and he only uses one of the timelines to show you what it is. Should we take a look? It's going to be a little bit of history here. Some interpret Daniel's kings as literal kings, but they assume that the timelines are symbolic time. I'll just show you the chart right now. This is for Daniel 12. There is a 1335-day timeline that is there, that is the questionable one, okay? There is a 1260. And I was taught that 1260 gets you to the date of 1798. You start at 538 and it gets you to 798. I was taught that the 1290 timeline is one from the Dark Ages, 1,290 years, and it also gets you to 1798. The starting point, they say, is 508 BC, and you add on 1290, and you'll get to 1798. Then there's a 1335 timeline. They also use the starting point of 508. These are theologians, by the way, with PhD degrees, probably 3 or 4 of them. And they say 508 plus 1335, it gets you to 1843 as a date. So what is taught is that the Daniel 12 timelines are merely repeating things that you've already learned about in Daniel 7 and 8. Remember that hermeneutic. Yah does not repeat things of no great consequence. He's not repeating these timelines in Daniel 12 to tell you that there's something important, really important here about what happened in the Dark Ages. No, he's not. He's repeating these timelines in Daniel 12 because they're different. They belong at the very end of time. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this 1843. Let me just back up with a little bit of history. In 1798, when the Pope was taken captive, there was a great big sigh of relief and the people relaxed. It was like, oh, finally, we're out of bondage, because this reign of the papal system, there was a lot of persecution that went on. The Inquisition, you can read all about it. For 1260 years, he had rule over Yah's people. But when the Pope was taken captive by Napoleon, things changed a little bit. It was shortly after that that Bible societies were raised up and Bibles were printed. And people that could not afford a Bible, and you might remember that these big Bibles were about 6 inches thick and they probably weighed about 50 to 80 pounds. Not everybody could afford it. But because of the printing presses that were starting to be raised up, back in the 15 and the 1600s, the scriptures were beginning to be printed. Not everybody could afford them. And not everybody could read them because many of the people did not have an education. They went to the churches to hear what the Bible said, and the Bibles were chained to the post in the churches, the Catholic churches. Protestantism rose up, and in 1798 there was a reprieve for Yah's people. That's when the Bible societies began to spring up, and Bibles were printed. And around 1833, there were many people that were studying the prophecies. They had been studying them for a long time, for 10 or 20 years or more, and they found these prophecies in Daniel. They found these prophecies with timelines. And not only that, they found the truth of the second coming of Yahusha. That was not known before. That was a huge discovery. And when they started looking at these timelines in Daniel 12, and it's just fun to work with timelines. Everybody likes to work with them because we know that if we can understand the timelines, we know when things are going to happen. And they determined that the Daniel 12 timelines, the 1260 got you to 1798, and the 1290 got you to 1798. But where did that 1335 get you to? Well, they determined that it was 1843. Well, 1335 timeline has blessings. There's blessings to that timeline. But there was no blessings in 1843. In fact, there was 2 disappointments. They had used this timeline to set the second coming of Yahusha. They first had set it in the spring of 1843, and nothing happened. They set it into the fall of 1843, and nothing happened. It was in 1844 that they realized that they had made a mistake in calculating the timeline from the 2300 days, that when you cross the 0 year, you have to make an adjustment there because there is no 0 year. So they made their adjustment for the 2300 year timeline, and then they got this timeline, the 2300 timeline, to 1844. But they were saying that the 1335 timeline reaches to 1843, and that's where the blessing was. But there was no blessing in 1843, and there was no blessing in 1844. In fact, 1844 had a third disappointment, and it was the biggest one of all. So there wasn't any blessings in 1844. They understood a little bit more about prophecy, but they didn't understand what was happening. They were making a big mistake. But I want to tell you that Daniel has everything right. I wanted to also mention that the 1335 timeline is the one that kind of eggs at you with this secret. If Daniel had recorded that 1335 day timeline as 1336, 1336 years, this pattern that I'm showing you would have been hidden. Nobody would have been able to figure it out. You would not be able to figure out very easily that the Daniel 12 timelines belong in the future. Well, why is this so important? Because it would have presented a lot of problems. You would not know how to break open the Daniel 12 timelines to find the full meaning for Yah's people at the end of time. Because it would have been really easy for the PhDs to say, those timelines are all symbolic. They're all symbolic time. So you have to make 1 day equals 1 year. And here we would have been as people that were listening, and we wouldn't have known what to say. We wouldn't have known. But it's that 1335. This is all coming back to Daniel chapter 4. Why? Because he's telling you that if there if there is a timeline up here in the heavenly scene, okay, where it's a symbolic vision, then you have to do something different with the timeline. But he's got a timeline. He's got a timeline up there in the heavenly scene, and a lot of theologians say that this vision is symbolic. That's what they're telling us. I've looked at a lot of, oops, just a minute, I want to go back there. Daniel chapter 4 has the answers. He's the one that's going to break open. He's showing you that the heavenly scene here says 7 times. And if this vision was actually symbolic, you would have no choice, but you would have to convert it. But he's making it easy. He's showing you what to do with timelines. Using our logic and our common sense is really important when it comes to Daniel and Revelation and prophecies. If the Daniel 4 timelines would have been symbolic, King Nebuchadnezzar would have been released from his field of duty around 1953. That's a long time. But Daniel explains exactly how to work with timelines in this chapter. If any part of these many concepts are misunderstood, it will be absolutely impossible to understand the time frame of Daniel 12 and also of Revelation. And not only that, he's going to give us some clues about how to work with timelines so that we know what to do with timelines in the gospel. We're going to do that in the next session. Again, Daniel has used repetition to teach a really simple and important concept. Always remember that new prophetic rule, that Yahuwah does not repeat things that are of no great consequence. Daniel chapter 4 is a literal vision right from the beginning to the very end. The whole thing is literal. That means that the timeline is literal. There's no conversion necessary whatsoever. So that's the end of today's lesson. And next time we're going to look at some sneaky switches and some glitches. We're going to look at what the theologians are telling us to do. They are going to mess around with Daniel's rules. When you watch what Daniel is doing in his book and follow what he's doing in all of those visions, you will see very, very clearly, and I'm only giving you like one example. There's many of them. But when you follow his patterns, you'll know exactly what to do with his timelines. So that's the end for today. I just want to thank you very much for being with us. And I hope that you understand that and have fun with it. And as you go on to study more in prophecy, that you'll really enjoy your studies.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you for digging into this in absolute detail. We appreciate it because this is what will bring us to the truth. Thank you.